An old man was very angry because of all of the changes that were going on in the world in which he found himself aging. And when he went to church, he heard a young preacher read from a modern translation of the Bible. And in his frustration, he said, if the KJV, that is King James Version, was good enough for the Apostle Paul, it's good enough for me. Now, I agree with the premise that if X, then Y. But the proposition is wrong because it is based upon some faulty assumptions. Hi, I'm Randy Lovejoy of randylovejoy.com. And this is another Under the Hood video where we test the assumptions underneath our opinions, our views, and our activism so that we can make decisions in our lives, in our community, in our world that are more wise and more strategic and could really create good in this crazy world in which we find ourselves. You see, the King James Version of the Bible was a version of the Bible that was written in somewhere between 15 and 1600s is where it was developed. And it is probably the most published book in the English language. Not only that, but the King James Version of the Bible transformed Western culture. It transformed the English language. Listen to some of these phrases that were introduced and still used today in the English language through the King James Version of the Bible. To give up the ghost, the salt of the earth, put words in my mouth, a law unto himself. All of these phrases and more were introduced into our language that we use today because of the King James Version translation of the Bible hundreds of years ago. And as one scholar put it, who tried to count these up, he found at least 257 phrases that are presently used in the English language that came into our language through the King James Version of the Bible. Not only that, but many literary critics today say that the King James Version of the Bible is still one of the most beautiful translations of the Bible, even though we have other modern translations, particularly the Psalms. And listen to this. You know that famous dream speech by Martin Luther King Jr.? Well, in that speech, he quoted scripture from the King James Version of the Bible. Listen to this from the dream speech. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all them shall see it together. That is from the King James Version of the Bible. So, if the King James Version of the Bible is good enough for all of these people in Western history, it's good enough to transform our language, if it's good enough for Martin Luther King Jr., and if it was good enough for the Apostle Paul, then surely it is good enough for us. So let's think about Paul for a minute. Paul, whether it's by his detractors or by his fans, is agreed by everyone to be absolutely essential to the growth and development of Christianity, particularly the move of Christianity from being a sect within Judaism to becoming a global or a world religion. He was absolutely essential. And even though the Apostle Paul himself didn't like that title apostle, there's a place in one of the letters where he says, hey, I'm an apostle abnormally born. He thinks the disciples are the real apostles, and he just kind of came in late on the game. But even though he was a little shy about that title is stuck with him. The Apostle Paul, it is agreed by most scholars, wrote at least 7 books of the New Testament. 7 of the letters in the New Testament were written by the Apostle Paul, and up to 13 books are attributed to him and to his influence. So again, if the King James Version is good enough for the Apostle Paul, it certainly should be good enough for us because he wrote a big chunk of the Bible. But that's where that false assumption comes in, because the Apostle Paul wrote in Greek. The first English translation of the Bible, which wasn't even the King James Version of the Bible, it was a version put together by John Wycliffe a couple of hundred years earlier. That English translation didn't show up until much after Paul's death. Paul wouldn't have known about it, and if he was given the King James Version, that version of the Bible would be, as the saying goes, all Greek to him. And that's the problem with the King James Version for us today, is for many of us today, it doesn't make sense. It makes it difficult to read and to understand what the Bible is talking about. And so what we need are modern translations that are going to help us understand the Bible better. I agree with this premise. If the King James Version was good enough for the Apostle Paul, it's good enough for me. But the proposition itself is wrong based on some faulty assumptions. And that is why we're doing these under the hood videos. Because we've got to test the assumptions by which we come up with different propositions, different viewpoints, different beliefs in which we take action. Because otherwise, if we're working on faulty assumptions, we're already off on the wrong path. I totally understand where this old guy is coming from. I get it. There's this passage where the Apostle Paul gets knocked off of his horse on the Damascus Road. And listen to what it says in the King James Version of the Bible about that. He hears a voice of Jesus. Paul heard a voice of Jesus when he became a follower of Christ. And the King James Version of the translation says this. It says, "I am Jesus who thou persecutest. It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks." See, now that's why we have modern translations of the Bible. What are people going to do with that passage? The English language changes over time. That used to make sense. To us, it's confusing and we're not sure what the heck the Bible's talking about. It's all Greek to us. But in modern translations, we find different ways to phrase this in the ways that we talk about it today. I understand the old man's frustration in this story. We all have a similar kind of frustration in 2021. There's all sorts of changes that we're experiencing and that we're going through. But these changes are with us. They are going to continue to move forward. And we waste our energy trying to fight against these changes, and instead we need to do something different. That's what the KJV version is saying when we are kicking against the pricks. It means that you're kicking against the goads, a more modern translation, that we're trying to kick against things that are in action, that are moving forward, whether we like it or not. And what we need to do is to decide what assumptions are valid, how we need to move forward, how we're going to live in this new world in which we find ourselves. And one of the key ways we do that is by checking in on our assumptions, and we're going to keep doing this in future videos here. So if the King James Version was good enough for the Apostle Paul, it's certainly good enough for me, but it wasn't, so it isn't. We'll talk to you again later.